Every year, thousands of urban explorers pack up their flashlights, cameras, and backpacks to venture into the abandoned remnants of America's past. They go to old, decaying hospitals, forgotten amusement parks, and hollowed-out industrial factories. Most of the time, the only things they leave with are some cool digital photos, a bit of dust on their boots, and a unique story to tell their friends. But for 19-year-old Owen Vance and his girlfriend, Maya Lynn, a late-night trip to an abandoned asylum in late 2021 would teach them a terrifying lesson. They would learn that when you break into a place that was built to hold suffering, you might not be the only one leaving when the sun comes up. The setting for the story is the rural outskirts of Choice, Pennsylvania, just an hour outside of Philadelphia. It was the 14th of November, 2021, a night where the autumn air was completely frozen, biting at your skin, and a thick, heavy mist was rolling off the nearby Susquehanna River. The destination was the old Pennhurst State School and Hospital, a massive, sprawling brick campus that had been closed down for decades. While parts of it were used for seasonal haunted attractions, the vast majority of the old, unrenovated tunnels and outlying wards remained strictly forbidden, blocked off by rusted chain-link fences and heavy plywood boards. Owen was a sophomore at Temple University studying film. He wanted to capture some gritty, atmospheric B-roll footage for his final student project. Maya, an architecture major, was fascinated by the decaying brickwork and the eerie, skeletal structures of the early 20th century buildings. They arrived near the property around 11:30 p.m., parking Owen's dark blue Ford Focus a quarter-mile away on a narrow dirt turnout hidden by overgrown pine trees. They slipped through a tier in the perimeter fence, their breath forming rapid, white clouds in the freezing air. The silence of the asylum campus was heavy, almost suffocating. The only sound was the distant, rhythmic clicking of a loose piece of corrugated metal flapping against a roof in the biting wind. They made their way to the rear of the old dietary building, where a small basement window had been smashed open by previous trespassers. One by one, they dropped down into the absolute pitch blackness inside. Owen clicked on his high-powered tactical flashlight, the bright white beam cutting through decades of dust, peeling lead paint, and scattered debris. The air inside smelled terribly old, metallic, and damp, like a wet basement that had been sealed tight since the 1980s. For the first hour, everything went exactly according to plan. Owen captured incredible, haunting footage of rusted gurney frames, shattered medicine bottles, and old, handwritten medical logs rotting on the floorboards. At exactly 12:45 a.m., they reached the entrance of the subterranean tunnel system. These were the narrow, concrete passages that connected all the wards underground, used to transport supplies and patients during the harsh Pennsylvania winters. The tunnel was exceptionally cold, the concrete walls damp to the touch, with puddles of black, stagnant water reflecting the light of Owen's flashlight. As they walked deeper into the tunnel, Maya suddenly stopped. She grabbed Owen's jacket sleeve, her fingers digging tight into the fabric. She whispered, asking him if he heard that. Owen stopped walking. He held his breath, tilting his head forward into the darkness. At first, there was nothing but the steady, slow drip of water from the ceiling pipes striking the puddles below. Drip, pause, drip. But then, from about 50 feet ahead of them, where the tunnel took a sharp 90-degree turn into the dark, came a different sound. It was a soft, barefoot slapping sound against the wet concrete. Slap, slap, slap. It was irregular, halting, as if whatever was making the sound was dragging one of its feet behind it. Owen immediately assumed it was another urban explorer, or perhaps a homeless person seeking shelter from the freezing November cold. He raised his flashlight, directing the beam straight down the center of the tunnel, and called out a tense hello. The moment his voice echoed through the concrete chamber, the slapping sound stopped completely. Owen and Maya stood frozen for 20 seconds waiting for a reply. No one answered. The silence returned, but it felt much heavier now, charged with a sudden, malicious energy. Owen, feeling a primitive survival instinct screaming in the back of his mind, decided they had enough footage. He told Maya they were leaving. They turned around and hurried back the way they came, slipping out of the basement window and running through the dark, misty campus until they reached the safety of the Ford Focus. They locked the doors, turned the heater on high, and Owen drove frantically back toward their off-campus apartment in North Philadelphia, relieved to leave the asylum behind. They arrived at their apartment, a modest second-floor unit in a converted brick row house, around 2:15 a.m. The neighborhood was quiet, the streets lined with parked cars glistening under the yellow hum of the city streetlights. They went inside, locked the deadbolt, threw their dirty clothes into the hamper, and crawled into bed, exhausted from the adrenaline rush. Within 15 minutes, Owen fell into a deep sleep. At 4:10 a.m., Owen woke up. He didn't wake up because of a nightmare, he woke up because he felt an intense, freezing draft cutting across his face. The apartment was usually warm, but right now, the bedroom air was so cold, he could see his own breath rising toward the ceiling in the dim light coming from the window. Owen sat up, rubbing his eyes. He looked over at Maya, who was still fast asleep, curled under 3 layers of blankets. He figured the old radiator system had failed, or perhaps he had left the kitchen window cracked open after dinner. He slid out of bed, his bare feet hitting the freezing floorboards, and walked out into the small, narrow hallway that connected the bedroom to the living room and kitchen. The apartment was pitch black. Owen didn't want to turn on the overhead lights and wake Maya, so he used the screen of his smartphone to light his path. As he stepped into the living room, he noticed that the front door of the apartment was slightly ajar. A 2-inch gap of darkness separated the door from the wooden frame. Owen's heart skipped a beat. He was absolutely certain he had locked the deadbolt when they came home. He approached the door slowly, his hand trembling as he reached out to touch the brass handle. He looked through the gap, peering out into the dimly lit communal stairwell of the row house. The stairwell was empty. The front building door downstairs was shut tight. Owen rationalized it. He thought maybe the old frame had shifted in the cold weather, causing the lock to slip out of the strike plate. He pushed the door shut, turned the heavy deadbolt until it made a loud, reassuring click, and turned around to go back to bed. As he turned, the light from his phone screen swept across the small kitchen counter. Sitting on the center of the counter was Owen's tactical flashlight, the one he had used inside the asylum. The one he was positive he had left inside his backpack, which was currently sitting on the floor by the front door. But that wasn't what made the blood turn to ice in Owen's veins. The flashlight was turned on. It wasn't casting its full bright beam because the lens was pressed flat against the wooden surface of the counter, but a dull circular ring of white light was leaking out from underneath the casing. And next to the flashlight, stamped clearly into the dust of the counter, was a wet, dark mark. It was the outline of a bare human foot, but the print was completely distorted. The heel was narrow, elongated, and the toes were splayed out at unnatural angles, leaving behind a faint, greasy residue that smelled heavily of stagnant, brackish tunnel water. Owen stood perfectly paralyzed in the center of the dark living room, his phone trembling in his grip. The smell of the asylum tunnel, that copper-sharp, decaying stench, was suddenly filling the small apartment, growing stronger with every passing second. Then, from the dark hallway leading back to his bedroom, Owen heard a sound. It wasn't a creaking floorboard, it was the soft, wet, barefoot slapping sound against the hardwood. Slap, slap, slap. The sound was coming from inside his own bedroom, right where Maya was sleeping. And as Owen watched in absolute horror, the bedroom door, which he had left wide open, began to slowly swing shut from the inside. The bedroom door clicked shut, the small latch snapping into the frame with a sound that felt as loud as a gunshot in the silent apartment. Owen stood completely frozen in the dark living room. The wet, rhythmic slapping sound had stopped the moment the door closed, leaving the apartment in a suffocating, heavy silence. The copper-sharp stench of the asylum tunnel was now so thick in the air it made his eyes water. Maya was still inside that room. The thought of his girlfriend being trapped in the dark with whatever had made that footprint broke through Owen's paralysis. He dropped his phone onto the living room rug, grabbed the heavy cast-iron tactical flashlight off the kitchen counter, and sprinted down the short hallway. He threw his entire weight against the bedroom door, slamming it open so hard the doorknob gouged a hole into the drywall behind it. The bedroom was freezing, the large window facing the street was wide open, the white curtains billowing wildly in the icy November wind, letting the freezing mist from the city streets roll across the floorboards. Owen raised the flashlight, clicking the tailcap button. The powerful white beam sliced through the darkness, immediately landing on the bed. The blankets were tossed aside. Maya was not under them. Owen's heart dropped into his stomach. He frantically swept the light across the room, the desk, the television stand, the corners. Nothing. He lunged toward the bed, peering over the edge to see if she had fallen to the floor. There, wedged into the narrow, dark space between the mattress and the wall, was Maya. She was curled into a tight, defensive ball, her knees pulled up to her chin, her hands wrapped white-knuckled around her head. She was shivering violently, her eyes wide and bloodshot, staring blankly at the open window. Owen dropped to his knees, reaching out to touch her shoulder. The moment his fingers brushed her skin, she let out a silent, breathless gasp, her entire body flinching away from him. Owen whispered her name, telling her it was him, that she was safe. It took 3 agonizing seconds for her eyes to focus on his face. When she recognized him, she collapsed into his chest, sobbing so hard she could barely draw air into her lungs. Through her ragged breaths, she managed to whisper what had happened. She said she had woken up from the cold draft just like Owen had. She opened her eyes in the dark, intending to call out his name, but she stopped because she realized there was someone standing at the foot of the bed. In the dim light from the street lamp outside, she could see a figure. It was entirely naked, its skin an unnatural, bruised gray color covered in patches of dried mud and river silt. The limbs were impossibly thin, the joints swollen and distorted, and it was hunched over at a horrific, unnatural angle, its long arms dangling almost to the floorboards. Maya said the creature didn't move for a long time. It just stood there in the dark, listening to the sound of Owen walking out into the living room. Then, very slowly, it leaned forward, its hairless, smooth head stopping just inches away from her face. She said it didn't have eyes, just smooth, scarred skin where its sockets should have been, but it tilted its head from side to side, sniffing the air, letting out a faint, wet, clicking sound from deep within its throat. When it heard Owen picking up the flashlight in the kitchen, the creature didn't run out the window. It slowly backed away, pulled the bedroom door shut, and then, with absolute silence, it slid backward into the shadows of the open closet. Owen's blood ran completely cold. He was still sitting on the floor, holding Maya against his chest. Slowly, inevitably, his eyes drifted away from his girlfriend and focused on the far corner of the bedroom. The closet door was wide open. Owen raised the tactical flashlight, his hand shaking so violently the beam of light danced erratically across the walls. He focused the bright white circle directly into the interior of the closet, cutting through the hanging jackets and rows of shoes. The closet was empty. But hanging from the metal clothing rod, right in the center of the space, was the heavy canvas backpack Owen had used at the asylum. The zipper had been completely torn open. Inside, his film camera was missing. Then, from the dark open window behind them, came a sound. It wasn't the wind. It was a high-pitched, mocking imitation of Owen's own voice, echoing from the alleyway 3 stories below. It rasped out a single word, "Hello?" followed by a wet, rapid, barefoot slapping sound accelerating down the asphalt until it faded into the city traffic. Owen didn't wait for the police. He dragged Maya out of the apartment, leaving everything they owned behind, got into his Ford Focus, and drove straight to the nearest precinct station in downtown Philadelphia. The police investigation yielded terrifying physical evidence, but no suspects. When detectives searched the apartment later that morning, they found the missing film camera sitting on the fire escape outside the bedroom window. The lens was smashed, but the digital memory card inside was completely intact. When federal investigators extracted the data from the card, they discovered that 3 new video files had been recorded between 3:45 a.m. and 4 a.m. that night while Owen and Maya were asleep. The footage was captured from a high angle, looking directly down at the bed from the ceiling rafters. The videos showed both Owen and Maya sleeping peacefully under the blankets, completely oblivious to the fact that something was crouching directly above their heads, holding the camera with long gray fingers, filming them in the pitch blackness for 15 uninterrupted minutes. The identity of the entity has never been established. The Pennhurst State Hospital campus was placed under 24-hour armed security surveillance shortly after the incident, but no transient matching that description was ever found in the subterranean tunnels. Owen and Maya dropped out of Temple University that week. They relocated to a high-rise concrete apartment building in downtown Chicago, choosing a unit on the 22nd floor entirely surrounded by steel, glass, and thousands of people. To this day, they refuse to travel anywhere near rural Pennsylvania, and they never go hiking or exploring. But according to Owen, the psychological damage is something they can never outrun. Because every time it rains in the city and the streets get slick and wet, he looks out his window at the crowds below, terrified that he will hear that soft barefoot slapping sound on the pavement and realize that whatever they woke up in those tunnels is still following them home. Most of us receive dozens of text messages every single day. They are usually completely mundane things like a reminder to pick up milk on the way home, a funny meme from a coworker, or a quick check-in from a family member. We look at them, we type out a quick response, and we completely forget about them. But for 23-year-old Caleb Ross, a text message received on the night of the 21st of October 2020 would become a permanent, horrifying fixture in his mind. It was a message that didn't just break the silence of a cold autumn night. It was a message that defied physical reality. To understand this story, we have to look at the geography. Caleb was a graduate student studying environmental science at the University of Montana in Missoula. He was an avid outdoorsman, a guy who spent his free time mapping remote trails and studying wildlife patterns in the surrounding wilderness. He lived alone in a small rented cabin just off Highway 12, right near the edge of the Lolo National Forest. This cabin was isolated. It sat on a small clearing surrounded by massive, dense stands of ponderosa pine and Douglas fir. The nearest neighbor was over a mile down the road, and during the late autumn months, when the tourists left and the first heavy snows began to threaten the valley, the silence out there was absolute. It was the kind of silence that made you hyper-aware of every single noise, the wind through the needles, the creak of the porch, the scamper of small animals in the brush. On this particular Wednesday, the weather was brutally cold. A dry, freezing wind was howling down from the mountains, shaking the branches of the trees and rattling the loose tin flashing on Caleb's roof. By 10:30 p.m., Caleb had finished his dinner and was sitting at his wooden desk reviewing topographical maps on his laptop. His only company was the crackle of the wood-burning stove in the corner of the room. Around 10:45 p.m., his phone, which was sitting on the mattress of his bed across the room, buzzed loudly against the wooden frame. Caleb didn't get up right away. He was deep in his work, and out in the Lolo area, cell service was notoriously spotty. Messages often got delayed for hours in the network queue before suddenly pushing through all at once. He figured it was just his mother or his classmate checking in on a project. 5 minutes later, the phone buzzed again. Then again. 3 times in rapid succession. Caleb sighed, pushed his chair back, and walked over to the bed. He picked up the phone and unlocked the screen. He had 4 unread text messages, all from his closest friend and hiking partner, a guy named Julian. Julian was supposed to be in Denver, Colorado, attending a week-long forestry conference. He had driven down there 3 days prior, and Caleb wasn't expecting to hear from him until the weekend. Caleb opened the conversation. The first 3 messages had been sent at exactly 6 p.m. that evening, according to the timestamp, but they had obviously just broken through the mountain signal block. The first message read, "Hey man, got bored of the conference early, driving back up through Idaho now, should be back in Missoula by midnight." The second message, sent 2 minutes later, read, "Taking the shortcut through the pass. GPS is acting weird, but I know the way. See you tomorrow." The third message was just a single blurry photo. It was taken from the interior of Julian's truck, looking out through the windshield into a pitch-black, narrow dirt road lined with dense trees. The headlights of the truck were cutting through a thick wall of fog, illuminating a white wooden mileage marker on the side of the road that read mile 14. Caleb smiled, typing out a quick response, telling Julian to drive safe and to text him when he got into town. But before he could hit send, his phone vibrated violently in his hand. A 4th message had just arrived. The timestamp read, 10:52 p.m. current time. The message read, "Caleb, please help me. I am on the road outside your house. My truck broke down. It is so cold." Caleb's smile vanished. He stared at the screen, a sudden wave of confusion washing over him. The road outside his cabin wasn't a main thoroughfare. It was a private, unpaved logging track that connected directly to the highway a mile away. There was no reason for Julian to be on this road unless he was specifically coming to visit Caleb. Caleb immediately hit the call button on Julian's contact profile. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times before going straight to a robotic voicemail greeting. Caleb hung up and quickly typed, "Julian, are you outside? I didn't hear a truck pull up. Where are you?" He waited for a response, his eyes locked on the screen. The wind outside slammed against the side of the cabin, making the log walls groan. The temperature inside the room felt like it was dropping rapidly, despite the roaring fire in the stove. 1 minute passed. 2 minutes. Then, the 3 little gray dots appeared on the screen, signaling that Julian was typing. Caleb held his breath. The text popped up. It read, "The headlights are dead. The battery is dead. I am walking up the driveway now. I can see your porch light. Please unlock the door." Caleb stood perfectly still in the center of his bedroom. A cold knot of anxiety began to tighten in his stomach. He looked toward the front of the cabin. The main living area had a large double-paned glass window that looked out directly over the gravel driveway and the front porch. Caleb walked out of the bedroom, his socks making no sound on the hardwood floor. He approached the window, keeping his body slightly off to the side, and reached out to part the heavy curtains. He peered outside into the freezing night. The yellow porch light was on, casting a dim, triangular glow over the wooden steps and the first 15 feet of the gravel driveway. Beyond that glow, the forest swallowed everything in total, absolute darkness. The freezing wind was whipping the branches of the pine trees back and forth, creating jumping, chaotic shadows across the gravel. The driveway was completely empty. There was no truck. There was no silhouette of a man walking up the path. There was nothing. Caleb frowned, pulling out his phone again. He checked his signal. He had 2 bars, which was normal. He typed out, "Julian, I am looking out the window right now." "You aren't in the driveway. Are you at the wrong cabin?" He hit send. The message marked as delivered instantly. Caleb kept his eyes fixed on the empty, windswept porch, waiting to see his friend walk out of the dark trees. Then, his phone buzzed again. Caleb looked down at the screen. The message from Julian read, "Look closer. I am standing right under the porch light. I am waving at you." Caleb's heart gave a violent, uncomfortable thud against his ribs. He looked back up through the glass window, his eyes scanning the small wooden porch. The yellow bulb illuminated the empty rocking chair, the stack of firewood, and the clean, bare wooden floorboards. There was absolutely nobody there. Caleb felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. This didn't feel like Julian. Julian wasn't a prankster. He was a serious, literal-minded guy who hated horror movies and practical jokes. Caleb backed away from the window, his hand instinctively reaching for the heavy iron deadbolt on the front door, ensuring it was turned completely to the locked position. He walked back into the kitchen area, grabbed a heavy flashlight from the counter, and decided he was going to call the local sheriff's department to report a potential prowler on his property. But before he could dial 911, his phone vibrated again, a new message from Julian. The text read, "Why did you move away from the window? I can see your flashlight. Let me in. It is so cold out here." Caleb stopped breathing. He stood in the dark kitchen, the phone screen illuminating his face in a pale blue glow. Whoever was sending these messages wasn't miles away on a delayed network. They were watching him in real time. They had seen him move away from the window. They had seen him grab the flashlight. Caleb's thumbs shook as he typed, "Who is this? This isn't Julian. Stop messing with me or I am calling the police." He hit send. The response came back in less than 3 seconds. The text read, "It is Julian, Caleb. I promise. Look at the photo I just sent you." Caleb scrolled up. A new image file was loading at the bottom of the chat window. The digital progress bar crawled forward slowly, 10%, 50%, 90%, before the image finally snapped into sharp, high-definition clarity. Caleb stared at the screen, and the air left his lungs completely. The photo was a close-up shot taken from outside the cabin. It was looking directly through the double-paned glass window of the living room, focused entirely on Caleb, who was standing in the dark kitchen holding his phone. The reflection of the yellow porch light was visible in the corner of the glass, meaning the person taking the photo was standing exactly where Caleb had just been looking. But they were completely invisible to the naked eye. Caleb dropped the phone onto the kitchen counter, his mind fracturing into pure, unadulterated panic. He raised his flashlight, pointing it toward the window, and activated the high-powered beam. The bright white light hit the glass, reflecting back at him, showing nothing but the empty porch outside. Then, from the bedroom down the short hallway, came a sound. It wasn't the wind. It was the sharp, distinctive chime of a text message alert. But it didn't come from Caleb's phone. Caleb's phone was sitting right in front of him on the kitchen counter. The sound came from inside the dark bedroom, coming from the corner of the room near the closet. It was the specific, default ringtone of Julian's phone. And as Caleb stood frozen in the kitchen, his flashlight beam trembling against the wall, his own phone on the counter buzzed one final time. The text read, "I found another way in. Turn around." The ringtone from the bedroom closet didn't stop. It chimed again, a cheerful electronic melody that felt completely twisted and wrong in the frozen silence of the cabin. Caleb did not turn around. His entire body felt like it had been plunged into liquid ice. He stood in the dark kitchen, his knuckles white around the handle of the flashlight, his eyes locked on his own phone screen where that final text message was still glowing in the dark. "I found another way in. Turn around." His engineering mind, the practical part of him that mapped wilderness trails, completely shattered. If Julian's phone was ringing inside the bedroom closet, then Julian wasn't in Denver. He wasn't on the highway. He was here, or at least his phone was. Then, the ringtone abruptly cut off. In its place came the sound of a heavy, wet fabric shifting against the wooden walls inside the bedroom closet. It was followed by the dry, metallic click of the closet door handle being turned from the inside. Caleb didn't look back. He didn't check the bedroom. He grabbed his phone off the counter, lunged toward the cabin's front door, and ripped the heavy iron deadbolt back. He threw the door open, flew out onto the front porch, and scrambled down the wooden stairs into the freezing Montana night. He didn't go for his truck. If his truck didn't start, he would be trapped in an enclosed space. Instead, he bolted straight into the dense tree line, sprinted past the gravel driveway, and ran blindly down the unpaved logging track toward Highway 12. The wind was screaming through the ponderosa pines, the freezing air burning his lungs with every desperate breath. He didn't have his winter jacket, only his flannel shirt, and within minutes, his hands were completely numb. He kept his flashlight turned off, navigating the dark dirt road by the faint moonlight filtering through the canopy, terrified that if he turned the light on, he would see something running alongside him in the trees. After what felt like an eternity, Caleb burst out onto the empty asphalt shoulder of Highway 12. He sprinted to the center of the road, waving his arms frantically as the headlights of a lone commercial semi-truck rounded the bend. The truck brakes screeched, the massive vehicle groaning to a halt just yards away from him. The driver, seeing a young man shivering violently, half frozen and completely consumed by panic, hauled Caleb into the cab and immediately called the Missoula County Sheriff's Department. 2 patrol cars arrived at Caleb's cabin at approximately 11:40 p.m. The deputies breached the open front door with their service weapons drawn, searching the small perimeter. The cabin was completely empty. The fire in the wood-burning stove was still crackling, throwing warm orange light across the empty living room. When the deputies entered the bedroom, they focused their flashlights on the closet door at the back of the room. The door was wide open. Sitting perfectly in the center of the closet floor, neatly arranged on top of a clean white towel, was Julian's smartphone. Next to the phone lay Julian's wallet, his driver's license, and his truck keys. The Missoula County forensics team arrived hours later to process the device. When they opened the text history on Julian's phone, they confirmed that no messages had been sent to Caleb from that device since Julian had left for Denver 3 days prior. The entire text conversation Caleb had witnessed on his own screen, the updates about the drive, the photo of mile 14, the horrifying real-time descriptions of his movements, did not exist on the network logs. According to the service provider, Caleb's phone had received those messages from an unlisted, untraceable virtual routing number that had spoofed Julian's contact ID. But the real horror of the investigation came 3 days later when a state trooper found Julian's Ford F-150 truck abandoned down a steep ravine off an unmaintained mountain pass 80 miles away from Caleb's cabin. The truck had crashed into a boulder. The front windshield was shattered, and the battery was completely dead. When search and rescue teams descended into the ravine, they found Julian's body inside the vehicle. The coroner's report concluded that Julian had died from internal injuries sustained in the crash at approximately 6:15 p.m. on Wednesday evening, exactly 15 minutes before Caleb received the first text message with the photo of mile 14. The photo itself was analyzed by federal investigators. When they enhanced the dark, blurry image looking out through the truck windshield into the foggy road, they realized they weren't looking at an empty path. Crouched right at the base of the white mileage marker, completely hidden in the shadows of the fog, was a tall, skeletal figure, its long arms wrapped around its knees, staring directly into the truck's headlights. The entity that intercepted Julian's route and manipulated Caleb's phone has never been identified. Caleb Ross never returned to his cabin in the Lolo National Forest. He abandoned his graduate studies, sold his equipment, and moved back to his family's home in Ohio, completely refusing to own a smartphone or use digital messaging platforms for the rest of his life. The case remains on the books as an unexplained missing persons investigation with elements of cyber stalking, but the file has been cold for years. The only piece of unresolved evidence is a single detail that Caleb noticed weeks after the incident, when he was reviewing his old phone bills. On the night of October 21, at exactly 10:54 p.m., 2 minutes after the final text was received, Caleb's phone registered an incoming data transfer that lasted for 40 seconds. The source was the same untraceable number. The file transferred was an audio recording. If you play it today on the Sheriff's Department's secure database, all you can hear through the static is the heavy howling sound of the Montana wind, followed by a voice that sounds exactly like Julian's, whispering a single chilling phrase over and over into the darkness. He told me what to type. The sport of cave diving is widely considered to be one of the most dangerous extreme activities on the planet. When you go skydiving or mountain climbing, if something goes wrong, your instinct is to look up toward the open sky where the rescue can come from. But when you are hundreds of feet deep inside an underwater cave system, there is no up. Up is solid stone. There is only forward, backward, and the absolute crushing darkness of the earth. If you make a mistake, even a tiny micro mistake that takes less than a second to execute, the environment does not forgive you. For 24-year-old Wyatt Briggs, a certified dive master from northern Florida, a routine exploration in the summer of 2019 would turn into a masterclass in survival terror. He would learn that a distance of just 100 feet can become an impassable chasm between life and the deep dark. The setting for this story is the Peacock Springs State Park, located in Live Oak, Florida. It was the 14th of July, 2019, a day where the southern humidity was so thick it felt like trying to breathe through a wet towel, with the afternoon sun beating down brutally on the oak trees and the limestone sinkholes. Peacock Springs is famous among the global diving community because it contains miles of flooded subterranean passages that twist and turn through the ancient Florida aquifer. The water inside these caves is crystal clear, sitting at a constant, refreshing 72 degrees, which makes it incredibly tempting for divers looking to escape the blistering summer heat. Wyatt was not an amateur. He had over 300 log dives, many of them inside overhead environments. He knew the golden rules of cave diving by heart. Always maintain a continuous guideline to the open water, never pass a restriction without assessing your air supply, and follow the rule of thirds: 1/3 of your air to go in, 1/3 to come out, and 1/3 held in absolute reserve for emergencies. On this particular Sunday, around 2:15 p.m., Wyatt arrived at the park entrance with his regular dive partner, a guy named Austin. They were planning to explore a lesser-known offshoot of the main tunnel system, a narrow, restrictive passage, colloquially known among locals as the Peanut Tunnel because of how tightly the limestone walls squeezed together in the center. They geared up at the wooden benches near the water's edge, checking their twin aluminum tanks, their primary and backup flashlights, and their regulator hoses. Everything was pristine. They waded into the cool teal water of the sinkhole, adjusted their masks, and dropped below the surface, leaving the hot Florida sun behind. As they descended into the mouth of the cave, the ambient sunlight quickly faded, replaced by the sharp blue-white beams of their high-powered dive lights. The main cavern was majestic, featuring giant white limestone pillars and wide vaulted chambers that felt like an underground cathedral. They clipped their primary reel to the permanent gold line that marked the main trail and swam deeper into the darkness. At exactly 2:45 p.m., they reached the entrance of the Peanut Tunnel, located about 400 feet from the surface opening and 80 feet below the ground level. The entrance was a small, horizontal slit in the rock face, barely wide enough for two divers to swim side by side. Austin went first, his fins kicking in a slow, precise, modified frog kick designed to prevent disturbing the delicate silt on the floor of the cave. If a diver panics and kicks wildly, the fine mud on the bottom will instantly stir up, turning the crystal-clear water into a zero-visibility room that resembles chocolate milk. Wyatt followed close behind, holding the aluminum spool, letting the nylon guideline slide smoothly between his gloved fingers. The tunnel was tight. The jagged limestone ceiling was rubbing against the top of Wyatt's twin tanks, creating a dry, scraping sound that echoed through his helmet. Scrape, slide, scrape. They navigated the narrow passage for about 15 minutes, moving deeper into an uncharted section of the aquifer. The architecture of the cave was changing, the walls becoming darker, stained with black manganese deposits that seemed to absorb the light from their flashlights. Around 2 p.m., they reached a dead-end chamber. The tunnel simply tapered off into a solid wall of porous stone. Austin turned his body around in the confined space, gave Wyatt the standard OK hand signal with his light, and indicated it was time to turn back. They had used exactly 1/3 of their air supply. Wyatt nodded, prepared to turn his body around to lead the way out along the line. But as he rolled his torso to the left, his heavy metal pressure gauge caught on a sharp, protruding shard of limestone. It was a tiny snag, a micro-movement. Wyatt didn't even feel it happen, but the sharp rock acted like a knife, severing the high-pressure rubber hose connecting his tank to the gauge. Instantly, a deafening, violent roar erupted inside the small stone chamber. A massive, chaotic explosion of silver air bubbles burst out from behind Wyatt's left shoulder, completely obscuring his vision and throwing his body violently against the ceiling. The high-pressure air was escaping at an alarming rate, creating a vacuum effect that began to freeze the regulator in his mouth. Panic is the ultimate killer in underwater environments. When your heart rate spikes, your lungs demand 3 times more oxygen, and your logical brain shuts down. Wyatt knew this. He forced himself to freeze, closing his eyes in the center of the roaring bubble storm, trying to locate the source of the leak by touch. Austin saw the explosion of bubbles and immediately swam toward his partner, pulling his own backup regulator hose free to offer it to Wyatt. But the visibility in the tiny chamber was deteriorating at a terrifying speed. The violent turbulence from the leaking air had completely disturbed the floor silt. Within 10 seconds, the crystal-clear water vanished, replaced by a thick, opaque wall of brown mud. Visibility went from 100 feet to absolute 0. Wyatt was completely blind. He couldn't see his own hands, he couldn't see Austin's light, and the roar of the escaping air was so loud he couldn't hear anything else. He reached out his right hand, searching for the nylon guideline, his only link to the living world. His fingers brushed against the thin cord, but as he gripped it, the line suddenly went slack. When Wyatt had been thrown against the ceiling by the air explosion, the sharp rock that severed his hose had also cut straight through the nylon guide wire. The line had snapped. Wyatt was floating in total darkness inside a mud-filled stone box 80 feet below the earth, with his air supply rapidly emptying into the cave. He reached out into the black water, trying to find Austin, but his hands met only empty space. Austin was gone, lost somewhere in the zero-visibility soup. Wyatt's pressure gauge was dead, but he could tell by the decreasing resistance in his regulator that he had less than 2 minutes of air left in his tanks. He made a choice. He couldn't stay in the chamber waiting for Austin. He had to move. He remembered the direction of the exit tunnel before the silt-out occurred. He dropped his body lower, pressing his chest flat against the mud of the cave floor, using his bare fingertips to feel the contours of the rock face crawling forward like a soldier in a trench. He crawled for what felt like miles, his lungs burning, the regulator making a dry, whistling sound as the pressure dropped to critical levels. Suddenly, his fingers met a vertical drop-off. He had crawled out of the peanut tunnel, but he wasn't in the main cavern. He had slipped into a completely unknown vertical chimney fissure that dropped down into the deeper, uncharted sections of the cave system. He checked his primary flashlight. The battery was dying, the bright white beam fading into a dull, sickly yellow glow that could barely penetrate the muddy water. Then his regulator gave one final dry gasp. The air was completely gone. Wyatt held the last pocket of air in his lungs, his throat locking up. He looked up, searching for any sign of a blue-white light from Austin's search team. There was nothing but black stone. He was trapped inside a vertical chimney, completely alone, precisely 100 feet away from the permanent gold line that led to safety. And his clock had just run out. With no air left in his tanks, the human instinct to survive takes over, and it is a terrifying thing. Your brain starts screaming at you to open your mouth and inhale, even though it knows that doing so will fill your lungs with water and end your life right there. Wyatt knew he had maybe 60 seconds before his consciousness slipped away. He refused to open his mouth. He reached back with his hands, fumbled with the plastic buckles of his heavy diving harness, and stripped the twin aluminum tanks completely off his back. He let them drop. The heavy metal cylinders vanished down into the black abyss of the vertical chimney, hitting the hidden bottom with a muted clunk. Without the weight of the empty tanks, Wyatt became slightly buoyant. He used his remaining strength to pull his body upward through the narrow limestone chimney, scraping his chest and arms against the razor-sharp rock edges. He didn't care about the pain. He just kept his eyes fixed on the darkness above him, praying for a miracle. As he reached the top of the vertical fissure, his vision began to tunnel. Black spots danced at the edges of his sight, and a wave of intense, warm dizziness washed over him, the first warning sign of hypoxia. He was about to pass out. Then, through the brown, muddy water, he saw it. It wasn't a flashlight. It was a faint, horizontal glint of metallic gold. Wyatt lunged forward through the water, his arms extending into the dark. His fingertips brushed against something solid and smooth. He gripped it with all his remaining force. It was the permanent gold line. When he had crawled out of the peanut tunnel, he had actually drifted sideways. He wasn't lost in an uncharted cavern, he was exactly 100 feet away from the main trail. The snapped line had disoriented him, but his blind crawl along the mud floor had brought him right to the edge of the park's main highway to safety. But Wyatt had no air. His lungs were collapsing, and his body was shutting down. He couldn't swim the 400 feet back to the surface on a single empty breath. Just as his grip began to slip from the gold line and his eyes started to roll back into his head, a bright, blinding blue-white beam of light cut through the silt right in front of his face. Another diver materialized out of the gloom. It was Austin. Austin had been searching the exit route, holding his breath and keeping his own light sweeping across the permanent line. Seeing Wyatt convulsing without his tanks, Austin lunged forward, grabbed Wyatt by the collar of his wetsuit, and shoved his own secondary regulator straight into Wyatt's mouth. Wyatt's body reacted automatically. He purged the regulator, purging the trapped water, and took a massive, desperate gulp of compressed air. The oxygen hit his brain like a physical shockwave, pulling him back from the very edge of unconsciousness. Austin didn't waste a single second. He hooked his arm under Wyatt's shoulder, pinning him tight against his side, and began to swim. They followed the gold line, moving through the main cavern at a rapid pace, completely bypassing the safety stops that divers normally take to prevent decompression sickness. They didn't have the luxury of time. Austin's tanks were running dangerously low from the rescue effort. At 3:24 p.m., the calm, sun-drenched surface of the Peacock Springs sinkhole was shattered as the two divers burst through the water, gasping for air. Austin dragged Wyatt onto the wooden steps of the dock, shouting for help. Other visitors in the park ran down the trail, hauling Wyatt out of the water and laying him flat on the grass. He was coughing up blood, his skin was blue from cyanosis, and his chest was covered in deep, bleeding lacerations from the limestone walls. Emergency medical technicians arrived 20 minutes later, administering high-flow oxygen and stabilizing Wyatt before rushing him to a specialized hyperbaric chamber in Gainesville to treat him for severe decompression sickness, commonly known as the bends. Wyatt Briggs survived the ordeal, spending over 40 total hours inside the hyperbaric chamber over the next 2 weeks to flush the nitrogen bubbles out of his bloodstream. He made a full physical recovery, though his chest and shoulders remained permanently scarred from the jagged rock of the peanut tunnel. The Florida State Park Service conducted a routine safety review of the accident site a month later. A team of recovery divers descended into the peanut tunnel to retrieve Wyatt's abandoned aluminum tanks and investigate the cause of the equipment failure. When the dive team reached the dead-end chamber where the accident had occurred, they found Wyatt's twin tanks sitting at the bottom of the chimney, exactly where he had dropped them. But when the lead diver shined his flashlight onto the limestone wall directly above the tanks, he froze. The high-pressure explosion of air from Wyatt's hose had cleared away decades of thick black manganese dust from the stone face, revealing something that had been hidden in the dark for a very long time. Carved deeply into the limestone wall, right next to the sharp rock shard that had severed Wyatt's hose, were 3 distinct horizontal tally marks, followed by a series of rough, hand-scratched letters that had been worn smooth by the water over decades. The inscription didn't look like it had been made by a dive master. It looked like it had been carved with a survival knife by someone trapped in the dark long before modern diving equipment even existed. The faded letters read, "No way out." To this day, Wyatt Briggs refuses to enter the water. He sold all of his expensive diving equipment, canceled his master certification, and relocated to the high, arid plains of Wyoming, working as a land surveyor where the earth is wide, dry, and completely visible under the open sky. He managed to move on, but the psychological weight of that summer afternoon has never left him. Because according to Wyatt, the true terror of the experience isn't the memory of the drowning or the darkness. The true terror lives in the realization of how fragile the line between life and death truly is. Every time he looks at a map or walks across a field, his mind measures the distance. He realizes that you can be completely safe, surrounded by family and sunshine, but if you take just one wrong step, you can find yourself exactly 100 feet away from a dark hole in the world where nobody can hear you scream. Most of us consider our homes to be the ultimate sanctuary. It is the one place where you can shut the front door, turn the deadbolt, and completely leave the outside world behind. When you are inside your own house, you control the environment. You control who comes in, who leaves, and what sounds are normal. But for 27-year-old Elijah Brooks, a software engineer living in the quiet suburbs of Columbus, Ohio, the winter of 2021 would shatter that sense of security forever. He would find out that sometimes the infrastructure meant to keep your house warm and comfortable can be used for something completely malicious. The setting for this story is a newly renovated 2-story colonial home on Oak Ridge Lane. Elijah had purchased the property in August of 2021. It was a beautiful house, built originally in the late 1950s, but a local contracting company had completely gutted the interior, installing modern drywall, new hardwood floors, and a brand new high-efficiency central heating and air conditioning system. This system relied on a massive network of wide galvanized steel air ducts that ran through the crawl spaces, beneath the floors, and inside the hollow walls of the entire house. By December of that year, Ohio was experiencing a brutal cold snap. The outside temperature regularly dipped into the single digits, and a heavy gray blanket of snow sat thick on Elijah's roof. Because he worked from home, Elijah spent almost 24 hours a day inside the house, his ears becoming deeply attuned to the rhythmic hum of the furnace kicking on in the basement and the gentle whistle of warm air rushing through the metal vents in every room. On the night of December 12, around 11:30 p.m., Elijah was sitting in his home office on the second floor, wrapping up a late-night coding project. The house was completely silent, save for the howling wind rattling the double-paned glass windows. As he typed away on his laptop, he heard a sound. It didn't come from outside, and it didn't come from the hallway. It came from directly inside the metal air vent located on the wall just 3 feet above his desk. It was a sharp, metallic clicking noise. Click, click, click. Elijah stopped typing and looked up at the rectangular slatted grill. The noise lasted for about 5 seconds, then stopped. Elijah let out a short breath and shook his head. He figured it was just the thermal expansion of the new metal ductwork adjusting to the sudden blast of hot air from the furnace. It was a perfectly logical explanation for an older house with a new system. He closed his laptop, turned off his desk lamp, and went to bed. But the next night, at exactly the same time, 11:30 p.m., the sound returned. This time, Elijah was brushing his teeth in the master bathroom. The bathroom also had a heating vent located low to the floor near the baseboard. As he rinsed his mouth, he heard the metallic clicking again, but as he listened closely, dropping down onto one knee to get closer to the floor grill, the clicking sound evolved. It wasn't just metal expanding. It was a distinct, rhythmic scratching sound. It sounded exactly like long, thin fingernails dragging slowly across the interior bottom of the steel duct. Scritch, scritch, scritch. Elijah frowned, a slight wave of unease passing through him. He immediately thought he had a pest problem. A raccoon, a large squirrel, or a nest of rats must have found a gap in the external dryer vent or the roof exhaust and crawled inside the duct network to escape the freezing Ohio winter. He decided he would call a local wildlife removal service first thing in the morning. He went to sleep, though the rhythmic scratching echoed faintly in his mind. The next morning, a technician named Dave from a local pest control company arrived at the house. Dave spent 2 hours inspecting the entire property. He checked the basement furnace, climbed a ladder to look at the roof vents, and even used a small snake camera to peer into the main trunk of the air ducts. When Dave came back down from the attic, he looked completely puzzled. He told Elijah that the system was completely pristine. There were no signs of animal droppings, no chewed wires, and absolutely no entry points where a rodent or a larger animal could have bypassed the heavy mesh filters. Dave joked that maybe Elijah was just hearing the wind, creating a vacuum effect in the pipes, charged him $80 for the service call, and left. Elijah felt relieved, but that relief would vanish the moment the sun went down. By 1 a.m. on December 15, the storm outside had worsened. The snow was drifting high against Elijah's front porch, and the wind was making the old timber frame of the house groan. Elijah was lying in his bed, the room dark, trying to fall asleep. Suddenly, the furnace in the basement clicked off, plunging the house into a deep, dead silence. A second later, the sound in the vents started again. But it wasn't in the bathroom, and it wasn't in the office. It was coming from the large return vent located directly above the headboard of his bed. The scratching was incredibly loud now, no longer muffled by the rush of forced air. It was a heavy, deliberate sliding motion. It sounded like something very large and very heavy, dragging its body through the narrow, horizontal metal shafts. Shh, shh, shh. Elijah sat up in bed, his heart instantly hammering against his ribs. He turned his head toward the wall grill. As he watched in the dim moonlight filtering through the window, he heard a low, wet, rattling breath escape from inside the vent. It was the distinct sound of human lungs exhaling into the metal pipe. Elijah froze, his entire body breaking out in a cold, terrified sweat. An animal doesn't breathe like that. An animal doesn't navigate a vertical duct system with that kind of weight. He realized with absolute horror that there was a human being crawling inside the walls of his house. Before he could even swing his legs out of bed, the scratching sound accelerated into a frantic, chaotic scrambling. It moved away from his bedroom wall, traveling at an impossible speed through the ceiling ducts toward the center of the second floor. Thump, 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 thump. The metal groaned and flexed under the weight above him. Elijah jumped out of bed, grabbed his smartphone from the nightstand, and ran out into the dark hallway. He looked up at the ceiling, where the main ventilation line ran toward the linen closet at the end of the hall. The sound stopped completely right above the linen closet. Elijah stood in the center of the hallway, the floorboards freezing beneath his bare feet. He held his phone with a trembling hand, his thumb hovering over the emergency call button. The silence of the house returned, but it was a heavy, malicious silence that made the hair on his arms stand up. Then, from inside the dark linen closet, he heard a soft plastic click. It was the sound of the ceiling access panel, the small square drywall hatch that led directly into the crawl space where the main heating trunks were installed, being slowly lifted upward. Elijah didn't wait. He sprinted back into his bedroom, slammed the heavy wooden door shut, and turned the small lock on the handle. He threw his weight against the door, his breath coming in ragged, terrified gasps as he dialed 911. The phone rang twice before a dispatcher answered. Elijah whispered frantically into the microphone, telling her his address and stating that someone was currently inside the ceiling structure of his home trying to get into his living space. The dispatcher was professional, telling him to stay behind the locked door and that she was dispatching 3 patrol units to his location immediately. As Elijah stood there, his shoulder pressed hard against the bedroom door, he felt a sudden vibration through the wood. It wasn't someone knocking on the door. The sound was coming from directly inside his bedroom again. Elijah slowly turned his head around, his eyes scanning the dark room until they landed on the rectangular metal heating vent located high up on the wall across from his bed. The slatted iron grill, which had been securely screwed into the drywall with 2 heavy steel screws, was completely missing. It had been pulled into the wall from the inside. And from the dark, square opening of the empty duct, a pair of long, pale human fingers slowly reached out, gripping the edge of the drywall. The long, pale fingers gripped the edge of the drywall with an immense, steady pressure. Slowly, a second hand emerged from the dark, square opening of the air duct, its knuckles scraping against the sharp metal casing with a dry, rhythmic sound. Elijah was still pinned against the bedroom door, his phone pressed tight to his ear. The 911 dispatcher was speaking to him, her voice a distant tiny buzz from the speaker, asking him if he was still safe. Elijah couldn't answer. His throat was completely locked by pure, primitive survival terror. In the dim, pale light of the Ohio winter night, Elijah watched as a face began to push forward through the narrow ventilation opening. It didn't look like a normal human head. It was impossibly thin, the skin stretched so tight over the skull that the cheekbones looked like razor blades beneath the flesh. The hair was patchy, matted with gray fiberglass insulation and black coal dust from the old chimney lining, but it was the eyes that made Elijah's heart completely stop. They were wide, entirely unfocused, and bloodshot, staring straight ahead into the dark room without a single blink. The individual's jaw was unhinged, sliding back and forth with that same sharp, metallic clicking sound Elijah had heard through the walls for days. The person was not trying to hide anymore. With a sickening, fluid grace that looked completely non-human, the emaciated torso began to slide out of the 10-inch duct opening. The shoulders collapsed forward, folding inward at an impossible angle to fit through the narrow steel frame. Elijah didn't wait to see the rest. He let out a breathless scream, pulled himself away from the bedroom door, and ripped the lock open. He tumbled out into the dark hallway, his bare feet skidding across the cold hardwood, and sprinted toward the stairs. Behind him, from inside the bedroom, came a heavy, wet times, thump times as the individual dropped from the wall onto the mattress of his bed, followed by the sound of rapid, four-legged scrambling across the floorboards. Elijah flew down the wooden staircase, nearly losing his balance on the bottom step. He didn't look back. He ran straight into the kitchen, threw open the heavy back door leading to the deck, and burst out into the freezing, knee-deep snow of his backyard. The sub-zero Ohio air hit his bare skin like physical needles, but the adrenaline overrode the cold. He scrambled through the deep snowdrifts, screaming for help, until he reached the wooden fence separating his property from his neighbor's house. Just as he reached the fence, the dark, quiet suburban street was flooded with the bright, flashing blue and red lights of 3 Columbus Police Department patrol cars. The units slammed their brakes against the icy asphalt, their sirens wailing into the night. Elijah collapsed over the fence, shouting to the officers, pointing frantically back at the second-story windows of his house. The officers breached the front door with their weapons drawn, moving through the colonial home in a tactical sweep. They searched the first floor, the kitchen, and then ascended the stairs to the master bedroom. The house was completely silent. The individual was gone. But what the forensic investigators and structural engineers discovered inside Elijah's home over the next 72 hours is what makes this case an absolute nightmare. When the police technicians climbed up into the attic crawlspace through the access panel in the linen closet, they found a fully functioning living space hidden between the drywall and the roof insulation. There was a sleeping bag, 3 dozen crushed aluminum cans of cheap soda, a collection of hand-drawn maps detailing the exact daily schedule of Elijah's movements, and a small portable toolkit. The suspect hadn't just broken into the house that night. By analyzing the dust patterns and the wear on the galvanized steel pipes, the engineers determined that the individual had been living inside the hollow walls and crawl spaces of the house since September, just weeks after Elijah had moved in. The local contracting company that had renovated the colonial home had hired a series of unverified short-term day laborers to help install the massive central heating system. One of those laborers, a deeply disturbed, unidentified transient from the Cleveland area, had intentionally modified the blueprint of the air ducts during construction. He had created a large horizontal trunk line that bypassed the standard structural supports, specifically designed to be wide enough for an emaciated human body to navigate. For nearly 4 months, while Elijah was coding at his desk, eating dinner, or sleeping in his bed, this individual was crouching directly above him or behind the drywall, listening to his conversations and watching him through the slatted grills of the vents. The metallic clicking sound Elijah had heard wasn't the expansion of the pipes. It was the suspect using a short screwdriver to unscrew the vent grills from the inside, slowly preparing the openings so they could be popped out at a moment's notice. Despite an intense, week-long sweep of the surrounding woods and suburban neighborhoods, the suspect was never captured. He had slipped out through a hidden basement exhaust vent before the police completely surrounded the perimeter of the property. His true identity remains a John Doe file in the Columbus Police Archives. Elijah Brooks never spent another night on Oak Ridge Lane. He sold the house at a massive financial loss to a corporate development firm that eventually demolished the entire structure. He relocated to a modern apartment complex in downtown Chicago, choosing a unit that utilizes exposed concrete baseboard heating with absolutely no central air ducts or vents of any kind. Elijah managed to rebuild his life, but the psychological horror of that winter remains entirely unhealed. Because to this day, whenever Elijah enters a public building, an office, or a hotel room, he doesn't look at the furniture or the decor. He looks straight at the walls, his eyes tracking the rectangular metal grills, his ears listening intently through the silence, terrified that he will hear a soft, rhythmic scratching sound from inside the steel and realize that someone is still listening from the vents. The appeal of amateur spelunking, or cave exploring, is that it allows regular people to become true pioneers. In a world where almost every square inch of the surface has been mapped by satellites, the deep underground remains one of the last places on Earth where you can step into a room where no human eye has ever looked before. But for 29-year-old high school biology teacher Brandon Cole, a weekend trip into the rugged wilderness of eastern Kentucky in the spring of 2022 would turn into a stark reminder of why some spaces were left unmapped. He would discover that being the first person to enter a cave doesn't mean you are the only thing inside it. The setting for this story is the Daniel Boone National Forest, a massive expanse of dense woods, steep sandstone cliffs, and thousands of hidden limestone sinkholes. It was the 23rd of April 2022, a damp, foggy Saturday where the spring rain had finally stopped. But the forest floor remained soaked, smelling heavily of wet moss, decaying leaves, and cold mud. Brandon was not a reckless adventurer. He was a methodical, careful guy who spent his free time documenting wild orchid species and mapping minor cave entrances for a local conservation group. He was incredibly fit, carried top-of-the-line gear, and always let the local ranger station know his general coordinates before heading out. Around 1:30 p.m., Brandon was navigating a steep, rocky ravine about 4 miles off the main hiking trail when he noticed a strange anomaly in the hillside. Hidden behind a thick curtain of tangled wild blackberry briars and overgrown ferns was a narrow horizontal fissure in the limestone rock. The opening was only about 3 feet wide, but a steady, surprisingly cold blast of air was blowing out from the darkness inside, indicating that the fissure connected to a substantial underground chamber. Brandon felt that familiar surge of excitement. He pulled out his rugged digital camera, turned on his primary high-powered headlamp, and dropped to his knees. He slid his backpack ahead of him, maneuvering his torso through the tight, muddy gap. The rock was sharp, tearing at his canvas jacket, but after a few yards of tight crawling, the ceiling suddenly vaulted upward. He stood up, brushing the wet clay from his knees, and shined his light around. He was standing in a majestic, pristine limestone cavern that dropped down at a sharp angle. The air was dead, heavy, and incredibly crisp, registering at a constant 55 degrees. The only sound was the slow, rhythmic ping of water droplets falling from distant stalactites and hitting the stone floor somewhere in the dark. For the next 2 hours, Brandon moved deeper into the cave system, completely fascinated. He followed a dry, ancient underground riverbed that twisted and turned through 3 massive chambers, each one larger than the last. He took dozens of high-definition photos of rare geological formations, his camera flash exploding with brilliant bursts of white light that briefly illuminated the ancient stone walls before plunging them back into the blue-white beam of his headlamp. At exactly 3:42 p.m., Brandon reached what appeared to be the absolute end of the cave system. He entered a long, narrow gallery that resembled a subway tunnel. The floor was covered in smooth, dark river pebbles, and the walls tapered inward until they terminated in a solid, vertical wall of jagged limestone. Brandon walked to the very back of the gallery, stopping about 10 feet away from the terminal wall. He set his backpack down on the pebbles, pulled out a fresh bottle of water, and decided to take one final panoramic photograph of the room before starting the long trek back to the surface. He raised his heavy DSLR camera to his eye, dialed the shutter speed down to allow for a long exposure, and pressed the button. The powerful external strobe flash mounted on top of the camera popped with a deafening electric crack, illuminating the entire back wall of the cave with a light as bright as the midday sun. The light vanished instantly, returning the room to the narrow beam of his headlamp. Brandon smiled, looking down at the small LCD preview screen on the back of his camera to check the exposure of the shot. As the digital image rendered on the screen, Brandon's breath caught sharply in his throat. The photograph was crystal clear. It showed the smooth pebble floor, the dark limestone walls, and the vertical rock face at the dead end. But standing precisely in the far left corner of the terminal wall, completely hidden within a deep shadow that his headlamp had missed, was a shape. It wasn't a rock formation. The geometry was entirely wrong. It was a towering, skeletal figure, standing well over 6.5 feet tall. The entity was completely naked, its skin a dull, bruised gray color that looked slick, oily, and completely hairless. It was pressed tight into the corner, its long, emaciated limbs folded inward against its torso like a compressed insect. But what made Brandon's blood run completely cold was its posture. The creature's neck was unnaturally elongated, its head tilted downward at a horrific 90-degree angle, staring directly across the empty room toward the camera lens. It had no visible nose or ears, just a smooth, pale skull. But where the eyes should have been, the camera flash had caught the distinct white reflection of 2 massive glassy orbs. Brandon stood perfectly paralyzed in the silent gallery, the small screen of the camera illuminating his face in a pale blue glow. His logical mind tried to reject it. He told himself it was an optical illusion, a strange combination of iron deposits and shadows on the limestone wall. He slowly raised his head, his hands shaking violently as he directed the bright blue-white beam of his headlamp toward the far left corner of the back wall. The corner was empty. There was nothing but jagged gray stone and a small pool of shadow. Brandon let out a ragged, trembling breath, trying to calm his racing heart. He reached down to pick up his water bottle, his eyes still fixed on the empty corner. Then, the dead silence of the subterranean gallery was broken by a sound. It didn't come from the ceiling, and it didn't come from the tunnel behind him. It came from directly inside the solid limestone wall in the back of the cave. It was a low, dry, rhythmic scraping sound, like heavy bone dragging slowly across rough concrete. Scrape, pause, scrape, pause. And as Brandon watched in absolute, unadulterated horror, a narrow vertical crack in the stone wall, a fissure that was barely 4 inches wide, began to flex. The solid limestone groaned under an immense, impossible pressure, and a long, pale, multi-jointed finger, ending in a sharp black claw, slowly pushed out from the darkness inside the mountain. The single, pale finger hooked around the edge of the narrow rock crack, its black claw digging into the soft limestone with enough force to send a small shower of white stone dust clattering down onto the river pebbles below. Brandon could not look away. The sheer, overwhelming terror felt like a physical weight crushing his chest, freezing the air inside his lungs. He stood completely still, his headlamp trembling so badly that the beam of light danced erratically across the back wall of the cave, while his brain desperately tried to process the physical impossibility of what he was witnessing. A 4-inch crack in solid stone cannot accommodate a living creature. But then, the limestone groaned again, a deep, vibrating bass sound that resonated right through the soles of Brandon's boots. A second finger emerged, then a third. The long, multi-jointed hands began to pull the edges of the vertical fissure apart. The rock wasn't breaking, it was flexing, shifting like clay under an immense, unnatural pressure from the other side. Slowly, the smooth, hairless crown of a pale gray skull began to push through the gap. The skin was slick and wet, glistening under the blue-white beam of the headlamp, completely free of any blood or tissue, despite the razor-sharp edges of the stone scraping against it. The entity was unhinging its own skeletal structure, compressing its ribs and shoulders flat to slip through a space no wider than a book. As the top half of the creature's face cleared the rock, its 2 massive, glassy black orbs snapped into focus. They didn't blink. They didn't adjust to the bright light. They locked instantly onto Brandon, absorbing the headlamp's glare like twin pools of ink. Its unhinged jaw slid open, and from deep within its elongated throat came a low, wet, rhythmic chattering sound, the dry clicking of bone rubbing against bone. The clicking sound echoed off the narrow walls of the gallery, magnifying until it sounded like hundreds of insects crawling inside Brandon's own ears. That sound broke Brandon's paralysis. He didn't grab his backpack. He didn't check his water bottle. He spun around on his heel, his heavy boots skidding wildly against the smooth river pebbles, and bolted down the narrow subway-like tunnel, running blindly back toward the mouth of the cave. The gallery was pitch black behind him, illuminated only by the frantic, bouncing beam of his headlamp as he ran. He sprinted through the first massive chamber, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. The air in the cave, which had felt crisp and refreshing hours earlier, now felt suffocating, smelling heavily of ancient, stagnant mud and iron. Behind him, from the darkness of the tunnel he had just abandoned, came a terrifyingly fast sound. It wasn't a running stride. It was a heavy, 4-legged scrambling, a rapid succession of wet, solid impacts against the stone floor. Thump, 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 thump. The entity was moving with an insect-like velocity, its long, double-jointed limbs propelling its emaciated body across the rocks at a speed no human could ever match. Brandon reached the steep, rocky slope that led to the second chamber. He scrambled up the loose stones on his hands and knees, tearing his fingernails against the rock, his headlamp swinging wildly. He looked over his shoulder for a fraction of a second. At the bottom of the slope, just 30 feet behind him, the blue-white light caught the towering gray silhouette. It was moving on all fours, its head hanging upside down from its elongated neck, its black eyes reflecting the light with a brilliant, predatory shine. The clicking sound from its throat was deafening now, vibrating through the solid stone walls of the cavern. Brandon screamed, a sound of pure, unadulterated survival panic, and threw his body forward through a narrow archway leading to the final chamber. He knew the entrance fissure was just ahead, but he also knew the entry track required a slow, tight crawl on his stomach. If he tried to crawl, the creature would catch him before his torso even cleared the gap. He reached the base of the final limestone wall, where the horizontal fissure sat hidden behind the ferns. The cold outside air was blowing inward, smelling of fresh rain and forest earth. Brandon didn't slide into the crawlway. Instead, he grabbed his heavy digital camera, which was still securely strapped around his neck, and turned around to face the dark archway. The creature burst into the chamber, its long arms reaching out, its black claws outstretched. Brandon raised the camera, targeted the center of the dark room, and slammed his finger down on the shutter button. The high-powered external strobe flash exploded with a brilliant, blinding pop of white light, completely illuminating every single corner of the limestone cavern with the intensity of a lightning strike. The creature let out a high-pitched, metallic shriek, a sound like tearing sheet metal as the sudden, intense light hit its dilated black eyes. It recoiled violently, its long limbs buckling underneath its weight as it threw its torso backward into the shadows of the rocks to escape the glare. Brandon didn't wait for the flash to recharge. He dropped the camera, threw his body flat into the mud of the fissure, and clawed his way through the narrow opening with a frantic, desperate strength. The sharp limestone tore through his jacket and cut deep lines into his back, but he didn't stop until his head burst through the curtain of wild blackberry briars into the foggy afternoon air of the forest. He tumbled out onto the wet dirt of the ravine, scrambled to his feet, and ran blindly through the dense woods of the Daniel Boone National Forest, leaving his gear, his camera, and the cave behind him forever. 3 hours later, a search and rescue team found Brandon sitting on the shoulder of a remote logging road, covered in wet clay, his clothes torn to shreds, and his back bleeding from dozens of deep lacerations. He was shivering violently despite the mild spring air, staring blankly into the trees, completely unable to speak. The local ranger station, working alongside the Kentucky State Police, dispatched a team of 5 armed deputies to locate the coordinates of the undocumented cave the following morning. Because Brandon had left his GPS tracker inside his backpack at the terminal wall, the team was able to navigate straight to the hidden fissure in the ravine. When the deputies breached the narrow opening and moved through the subterranean chambers, they found the cave completely silent. The dry riverbed was empty, and Brandon's backpack was still sitting on the river pebbles at the very back of the gallery, untouched. But what the forensics team discovered when they retrieved Brandon's dropped digital camera near the entrance is what turned this case into a classified federal file. The camera's internal memory card was completely intact. When the technicians developed the final image, the one Brandon had taken right before escaping into the crawlway, the photograph showed the entire final chamber lit up by the strobe flash. The gray, emaciated creature was caught perfectly in the center of the frame, its torso twisting backward, its long fingers shielding its hairless skull from the light. But the photograph also revealed something the headlamp had completely missed. The creature hadn't emerged from the rock alone. In the brilliant white light of the flash, the walls of the final chamber were shown to be covered in dozens of small vertical fissures. And from inside every single one of those dark cracks, a pair of long, pale fingers was slowly reaching out into the room, meaning the mountain wasn't just holding one entity, the entire cave system was a living hive. The Daniel Boone National Forest authorities permanently sealed the entrance to the fissure 3 days later, pouring tons of solid industrial concrete into the ravine to block the gap completely. The cave was erased from all local conservation maps, and the file was handed over to a federal agency, remaining closed to the public to this day. Brandon Cole never returned to teaching biology, and he never entered the state of Kentucky again. He relocated to a high-rise apartment building in downtown Manhattan, choosing a space on the 40th floor where the ground is a distant memory and everything is constructed of steel, glass, and solid concrete. He managed to rebuild a quiet routine, but the psychological scars of that spring afternoon have never left him. He refuses to visit parks, he cannot sleep in a dark room, and he uses a high-powered flashlight for any nightly activity. Because according to Brandon, the true nightmare isn't the memory of the chase or the creature's shriek. The true nightmare lives in the knowledge of how close the dark truly is. Every time he walks past a brick wall or a cracked pavement, his eyes involuntarily lock onto the gaps. He realizes that you can be completely safe walking through a modern city with absolute confidence, entirely unaware that just inside the solid structures of the world, something is sitting in the narrow spaces, chattering its teeth, and waiting for someone to find the crack in the stone. Most of us view old photographs as a gateway to nostalgia. You look at an old picture from your childhood or a vacation you took years ago, and it brings back this warm, comforting wave of memories. You remember who you were with, what the air smelled like, and exactly what was happening right before the shutter clicked. But for 25-year-old high school history teacher Julian Cross, a discovery made inside a vintage thrift shop in the winter of 2022 would flip that concept completely on its head. He would find out that a single photograph, frozen in time on a square piece of instant film, could become a window into a living nightmare. The setting for this story is the historic town of Savannah, Georgia. It was the 18th of January, 2022, a night where the southern coastal air was unusually freezing, forcing a thick, heavy sea fog to creep up from the Savannah River. This fog rolled through the cobblestone streets, wrapping itself around the ancient oak trees and the historic antebellum mansions, making the entire town feel completely isolated and heavy with secrets. Julian lived alone in a rented one-bedroom apartment on the second floor of a restored 1890s brownstone building right near Forsyth Park. He was a quiet, bookish guy who spent his weekends hunting for historical artifacts, old journals, and vintage cameras at local antique markets. On this particular Tuesday, around 4:30 p.m., just as the sun was beginning to drop below the horizon and the fog was rolling in, Julian stepped into a dusty, dimly lit thrift store called Past Tense Antiques on Broughton Street. The shop was a maze of old grandfather clocks, stacks of weathered books, and boxes of unsorted estate items. While rummaging through a wooden crate in the very back of the store, Julian's eyes landed on an old tan leather case. Inside was a vintage 1980s Polaroid Sun 600 instant camera. It was covered in a light layer of dust, but structurally it was in perfect condition. Julian, fascinated by the mechanical simplicity of old tech, bought the camera for $15, tucked it under his arm, and walked back to his apartment through the freezing fog. By 7:30 p.m., Julian was sitting at his kitchen table drinking a mug of black coffee. The apartment was completely silent, except for the rhythmic, low hiss of the steam radiator in the corner. He cleaned the camera body with a microfiber cloth, opened the bottom film bay, and was surprised to find that there was an old film cartridge still loaded inside. The mechanical counter on the back of the camera indicated that there was exactly one unexposed frame left in the pack. Curious to see if the chemical layers inside the 30-year-old film were still functional, Julian stood up, walked into his living room, and faced the large, dark window that looked out over the foggy street below. He raised the heavy plastic viewfinder to his right eye, pressed the red shutter button on the side of the casing, and let out a short gasp as the camera's internal flash exploded with a bright, blinding pop of white light. The camera let out a loud mechanical hum, and a single square Polaroid photo slowly ejected from the bottom slot. Julian pulled the wet print out, laying it flat on the wooden coffee table under the soft amber light of his floor lamp. If you know anything about classic Polaroid film, you know that the image doesn't appear instantly. It starts as a blank slate gray square, and over the course of 3 to 5 minutes, the chemicals slowly develop, revealing the image from the inside out. Julian watched the gray square. Slowly, the dark outlines of his living room window began to materialize. Then, the reflection of the floor lamp appeared as a soft orange blob in the center of the frame. But as the final chemical layers settled and the image snapped into sharp clarity, Julian's smile completely faded. The photograph wasn't just a picture of his living room window. Standing right outside the glass, on the narrow iron fire escape ledge that sat directly over the street, was a man. The flash from the camera had caught him perfectly against the thick white fog. He was remarkably tall, wearing a filthy, oversized gray wool coat that looked completely soaked with moisture. His head was bald, his skin an unnatural, waxy white color, and he was leaning his torso forward at a strange 30-degree angle, pressing his face flat against the exterior window pane. But what made the hair on Julian's arms stand up was the man's expression. His eyes were wide, completely bloodshot, staring straight through the glass directly into the camera lens. His mouth was stretched open into a wide, toothless grin that looked completely hollow and manic. Julian's heart gave a violent, uncomfortable thud. He immediately turned around and looked at the actual living room window behind him. The glass was empty. The thick sea fog was swirling against the exterior pane, but there was nobody on the fire escape. Julian let out a shaky breath, rubbing his temples. He tried to rationalize it using logic. It was an old pack of film that had been sitting inside a used camera for decades. The image he was seeing must be a double exposure, a ghost image from a photograph taken by the camera's previous owner 30 years ago, which had somehow failed to develop fully until Julian pressed the shutter tonight. It was the only explanation that made physical sense. Relieved by his own logic, Julian tossed the photo onto the coffee table, checked the heavy deadbolt lock on his front door, and decided to turn in for the night. He walked into his bedroom, turned off the lights, and crawled under the covers, listening to the heavy wind whipping the fog through the trees in the park outside. At 2:14 a.m., Julian woke up. He didn't wake up from a dream. He woke up because he heard a very distinct, sharp noise coming from the living room. It was a slow, rhythmic tapping sound against a hard surface. Tap, tap, tap. It didn't sound like wood creaking, and it didn't sound like the radiator. It sounded exactly like a long, thick fingernail clicking against a pane of glass. Julian lay perfectly still in the dark bedroom, his muscles completely locking up as adrenaline surged through his system. The tapping stopped for 10 seconds, then started again, louder this time, coming from the direction of the living room fire escape window. Julian pulled the blankets aside, his bare feet hitting the cold floorboards. He reached into his nightstand drawer, pulled out a heavy steel flashlight, and crept slowly out of the bedroom into the narrow, dark hallway. The apartment was freezing. The air felt heavy, damp, and smelled sharply of river silt and old wool, a scent that shouldn't be inside a locked second-floor apartment. Julian reached the edge of the living room. He didn't turn on the overhead lights. He kept his flashlight turned off, using the faint, pale glow of the street lamp filtering through the fog to navigate. He approached the coffee table, intending to grab his phone to call the Savannah Police Department. As he reached down toward the table, his hand brushed against the square Polaroid photograph he had left under the lamp. Involuntarily, Julian raised the photo to his eyes, looking at it in the dim gray light coming from the window. The image had changed. The chemical development process was completely finished now, but the man in the gray coat was no longer standing outside on the fire escape ledge. In the photograph, the living room window was wide open, the white curtains blowing inward. The tall, pale man had moved. He was now standing completely inside the living room, his oversized coat dripping water onto Julian's rug, his torso leaning forward at that same horrific angle as he stared directly at the bedroom hallway where Julian was currently standing. Julian's breath caught in his throat. He dropped the photo onto the floor, his mind fracturing into pure terror. A photograph cannot change after it is printed. It is a physical impossibility. Then, from the darkness of the living room right in front of him, came a sound. It wasn't a tap on the glass. It was the heavy, wet sound of a thick fabric shifting in the dark, followed by a low, wheezing breath that carried the distinct smell of stagnant river water. Julian raised his flashlight, his hand shaking so violently the metal casing rattled against his fingers, and pressed the button. The powerful white beam of light sliced through the darkness of the living room, illuminating the empty sofa, the rug, and the window. The window was shut tight. The deadbolt was in place. There was absolutely nobody there. But as Julian lowered the flashlight beam toward the floor, the light caught the surface of the coffee table. Sitting right next to the vintage Polaroid camera was a brand new, freshly developed square photograph. It was resting face up on the wood. Julian walked forward like a man in a trance, his boots feeling heavy as lead. He pointed the flashlight straight down at the new print. The photo was a high-definition shot of the dark hallway he had just crawled out of. It was taken from an angle inside the room, looking directly at Julian's back as he stood by the table. And standing right behind Julian in the frame, its long, pale fingers hovering just inches above his shoulder, was the man in the gray coat. Julian felt a cold sweat break out across his entire body. He didn't turn around, he didn't look behind him. He dropped the flashlight, lunged toward the apartment's front door, and ripped the lock open, screaming for help as he bolted out into the foggy, deserted corridor. Julian did not look back as he threw himself into the narrow, dimly lit communal corridor of the brownstone. He flew down the old wooden staircase, his bare feet barely touching the steps, and slammed his entire weight against the heavy glass double doors at the main entrance. He burst out into the freezing Savannah night, stumbling onto the wet cobblestones of Broughton Street. The sea fog was so thick now that the street lamps looked like distant bleeding halos of yellow light. Julian ran blindly through the mist, his throat raw, his chest heaving as the freezing air burned his lungs. He didn't stop until he reached the bright, neon-lit perimeter of a 24-hour convenience store 3 blocks away. The clerk, seeing a young man pale as a sheet, shivering violently in his pajamas and whispering incoherently about a photograph, immediately locked the store doors and called the Savannah Police Department. 2 patrol cars arrived at the convenience store within 5 minutes, and after taking a brief, chaotic statement from Julian, 3 armed officers escorted him back to his apartment building to investigate a potential home invasion. The officers led the way up the stairs, their service weapons drawn, their heavy boots thudding against the wooden steps. When they reached the 2nd floor, the door to Julian's apartment was still wide open just as he had left it. The officers moved through the small apartment in a tactical sweep, clearing the kitchen, the living room, and the bedroom. The space was completely empty. The windows were locked from the inside, the fire escape was clear, and there was absolutely no physical sign of a struggle or a forced entry. But what the responding officers found sitting on the wooden coffee table in the center of the living room is what transformed this case from a standard prowler report into an absolute psychological nightmare. The vintage Polaroid camera was sitting exactly where Julian had left it. Next to it, resting face up on the dark wood, were the 2 square photographs. The lead officer picked up the first photo, the one Julian had taken of the window. The chemicals had completely stabilized. The image showed the living room window, the white curtains, and the thick sea fog outside. But the tall, pale man in the gray coat was gone. The fire escape ledge was completely empty. The officer then picked up the second photo, the one that had materialized on the table, while Julian's back was turned. The photograph was a crystal-clear, high-definition shot of the empty hallway leading to the bedroom. But Julian wasn't in the frame anymore, and neither was the man in the gray coat. Instead, the photo was focused entirely on the wooden coffee table itself. On the surface of the table in the photograph, written in dark, wet fluid that looked like Black River silt, was a short, hand-scratched message. The officers immediately turned their flashlights down toward the actual physical coffee table in front of them to see if someone had written on the wood. The tabletop was completely clean. There was no silt, no moisture, and no text on the physical wood. But when they looked back at the photograph, the message on the table inside the image was sharp and legible. It read, "I am under the bed." A sudden, heavy silence fell over the room. The 3 officers slowly turned their heads toward the open bedroom doorway at the end of the hall. The lead deputy drew his weapon again, gesturing for the others to follow him. They walked slowly into the dark bedroom, their flashlights cutting through the gloom, and dropped down onto their knees to peer beneath the heavy wooden bed frame. The space under the bed was completely empty. There was nothing but dust bunnies and a spare blanket. However, when the detectives from the forensics unit arrived later that morning to process the apartment, they discovered a hidden crawlspace hatch located directly beneath the rug under Julian's bed. The hatch led to an old, forgotten maintenance shaft that ran through the hollow center of the 1890s building, connecting the basement directly to the floorboards of the second-story apartments. Inside that narrow, pitch-black shaft, the forensics team found a nest of old wet blankets, several empty water bottles, and a pile of discarded Polaroid film backings dating from the mid-1980s to the present day. The suspect hadn't just broken into the apartment that night. Someone had been living inside the walls of the building for months, using the maintenance shaft to observe Julian through the small gaps in the floorboards and the radiator pipes. The most terrifying discovery came when the FBI's cybercrime unit analyzed the vintage Polaroid camera itself. The internal mechanisms had been meticulously altered. Someone with an advanced knowledge of optics had installed a tiny secondary lens and a fiber optic delay circuit inside the film bay. The camera hadn't captured a ghost image, and it hadn't captured a supernatural event. The mechanism had been rigged so that whenever a photograph was taken, the secondary lens would secretly expose a pre-recorded image onto the next frame in the cartridge. The tall, pale man in the gray coat wasn't a spirit. He was a real, living person who had built the device, planted it in the thrift store on Broughton Street, and then waited inside the walls of Julian's apartment for him to buy it, bring it home, and press the shutter. Despite an extensive investigation that lasted for over a year, the identity of the man in the gray coat was never discovered. He had evacuated the maintenance shaft through a basement drainage tunnel before the police officers ever arrived at the building. Julian Cross never spent another night in Savannah, Georgia. He resigned from his teaching position the very next morning, packed his clothes into his car, and moved to a newly constructed concrete slab home in the desert suburbs of Phoenix, Arizona, a place with no basements, no old buildings, and absolutely no history. Julian managed to recover his routine, but the psychological scars of that January night remain completely unhealed. He refuses to look at old photographs, he does not permit cameras in his home, and he uses digital screens only when absolutely necessary for his work. Because according to Julian, the true horror of the experience isn't the memory of the freezing fog or the man's toothless grin. The true horror lives in the realization of how long he was being watched. Every time he walks into a room, his eyes involuntarily track the seams of the floorboards. He realizes that you can be completely alone, reading a book, or drinking a cup of coffee, completely convinced of your own privacy, while just inches beneath your feet, someone is sitting in the absolute dark, holding a camera, and waiting for you to take the final picture. The draw of exploring deep subterranean cave networks is that it forces you to confront a world that is completely alien to human existence. When you are hundreds of feet below the surface, the familiar rules of the upper world cease to apply. There is no concept of day or night, no cellular network, and no ambient warmth. If your main light source fails, the darkness that swallows you is so absolute that you can literally lose your sense of balance and direction within minutes. But for 34-year-old wilderness guide Austin Briggs, a solo exploration into an undocumented cavern in the rugged backcountry of southern Missouri in the autumn of 2015 would turn into a masterclass in psychological survival. He would discover that when you venture into the deepest, most isolated corners of the earth, the dark isn't always empty. The setting for this story is the Ozark National Scenic Riverways, a massive expanse of dense timber, steep limestone bluffs, and thousands of hidden, unmapped sinkholes. It was the 12th of October 2015, a day where the crisp autumn air was thick, smelling of dry oak leaves, damp moss, and the faint, cold scent of river limestone. Austin was a highly disciplined outdoorsman. He spent his free time mapping minor cave entries for a regional geology group, always carrying a tactical backpack, a heavy-duty 3-battery headlamp, and a secondary high-powered flashlight. He was a practical, level-headed guy who didn't believe in superstitions or campfire stories. To him, a cave was just an interesting rock formation, nothing more. Around 3:45 p.m., Austin was navigating a deep, rocky ravine about 5 miles off the main hiking trails when he noticed a small horizontal opening at the base of a towering limestone bluff. The fissure was partially obscured by a thick curtain of wild vines and overgrown ferns. A steady, freezing draft of air was blowing out from the gap, a clear sign that it connected to a massive, hidden underground chamber. Austin unbuckled his pack, pushed it ahead of him through the muddy opening, and squeezed his torso through the narrow gap. The sharp rock tore at his jacket, but after a few yards of tight crawling, the ceiling suddenly vaulted upward into a magnificent, pristine cavern. The air inside was dead, freezing, and heavy, registering at a constant 54 degrees. The only sound was the slow, rhythmic dripping of water striking the pebbles somewhere in the deep dark. Drip. Pause. Drip. For the next 2 hours, Austin moved deeper into the cave system, completely fascinated. He followed a dry, ancient underground riverbed that twisted through 3 massive chambers, each one larger and darker than the last. The blue-white beam of his headlamp cut through the heavy mist, illuminating majestic white stone pillars and ancient mineral deposits. At exactly 5:50 p.m., Austin reached a long, narrow gallery that resembled a subway tunnel. The floor was covered in smooth, dark river pebbles, and the walls tapered inward until they terminated in a solid wall of jagged stone. Austin set his backpack down on a dry, flat boulder, intending to take a quick rest before starting the long trek back to the surface. The silence in the room was total, absolute, and suffocating. Then, from the darkness at the very back of the gallery, about 30 feet ahead of him, came a sound. It wasn't a water droplet, and it wasn't a shifting rock. It was a slow, heavy, wet, sliding motion against the damp clay. Slide, pause. Slide, pause. It sounded exactly like someone dragging a massive sack of wet leather across the pebbles. Austin froze, his muscles locking up as his adrenaline spiked. He slowly raised his right hand, gripping his secondary high-powered flashlight, and snapped the 500-lumen beam straight toward the back wall. The brilliant white light sliced through the gloom, and Austin's entire body went completely rigid. Crouching right in the far corner of the terminal wall, fully illuminated by the glare, was an entity. It was impossibly tall, standing well over 7 feet, but its body was so emaciated that its ribs and elongated spine pushed sharply against its skin like jagged ridges. The flesh was a dull, waxy, bruised gray color, completely hairless, and glistened with a thick, clear fluid that looked like liquid mucus. Its double-jointed limbs were twice the length of a normal human's, its long arms dangling so low that its multi-jointed fingers, ending in sharp black claws, were buried deep into the gravel. But it was the head that made the breath catch sharply in Austin's throat. The creature's neck was long, thin, and twisted at a horrific 90-degree angle, causing its hairless head to hang completely upside down between its shoulders. It had no visible nose or ears, just a smooth, pale skull, but where the eyes should have been, the light beam caught the brilliant, blinding reflection of 2 massive, glassy black orbs. The creature was staring straight into the lens, its unhinged jaw wide open, revealing a series of jagged, calcified ridges running along its gums. From deep within its throat came a low, rapid, dry clicking sound, the rhythmic chattering of bone against bone. Click, 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 click. Austin stood perfectly paralyzed, the heavy flashlight shaking so violently in his hand that the circle of white light was dancing erratically across the creature's leathery chest. His logical brain completely fractured. The creature didn't retreat from the light. It slowly shifted its weight, dragging its left limb forward with a heavy, solid impact against the stone. Thump, step, thump, step. It was moving directly into the center of the beam, its upside-down head twitching rhythmically from side to side as the clicking sound from its throat grew louder and louder, filling the entire silent gallery. Austin realized with absolute certainty that if he didn't move immediately, he would never see the sun again. With a breathless scream of pure survival panic, Austin dropped his secondary flashlight, turned around, and bolted down the narrow subway-like tunnel, running blindly back toward the mouth of the cave. Behind him, from the dark gallery, the rapid four-legged scrambling started. Thump, 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 thump. The entity was descending the slope, its long limbs propelling its emaciated body through the narrow passages with an insect-like velocity, tracking the heavy vibration of his escape. Austin sprinted through the dark, twisting passages, his heavy boots skidding wildly over the loose, damp stones of the ancient riverbed. The blue-white beam of his headlamp bounced frantically up and down, illuminating the sweating limestone walls and the massive white stalactites that seemed to reach down like teeth from the ceiling. The air in the cave had turned hot and suffocating, carrying that sharp, copper-like stench of old rot and stagnant water that filled his throat with every frantic gasp. Behind him, the sound of the pursuit was gaining ground. It was a heavy, fluid, four-legged scrambling that vibrated right through the stone floor of the tunnel. Thump, 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 thump. The entity was moving with an impossible, insect-like velocity, its long, double-jointed limbs propelling its emaciated body across the rocks without a single slip. Austin reached the second massive chamber, a vaulted room where the trail split into two different tunnels. In his panic, he couldn't remember which path led back to the entrance. He paused for a fraction of a second, his headlamp sweeping across the dark openings. That microsecond of hesitation almost cost him his life. From the tunnel behind him, the creature burst into the chamber. It didn't stay on the floor. With a sudden, terrifying leap, it launched its 7-foot frame onto the vertical limestone wall, its black claws digging deep into the stone with a sharp, shattering sound. It began to scamper horizontally across the rock face, heading straight for the archway where Austin was standing. Click, 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 click. Austin let out a breathless cry, dove to his right, and threw himself into the narrower of the two openings. He scrambled forward on his hands and knees as the ceiling dropped down to a height of just 4 feet, forcing him into a tight, claustrophobic trench. He could hear the creature arrive at the entrance of the trench behind him. Because of its massive 7-foot height, it couldn't immediately sprint into the narrow gap. It let out a high-pitched metallic shriek, a sound like iron tearing apart that echoed off the stone walls so loudly it shattered the lens of Austin's headlamp. The light died instantly. The world vanished into absolute pitch-black darkness. Austin froze, his chest pressed flat against the cold, damp mud of the trench floor. The silence that followed was total, suffocating, and heavy. He covered his mouth with both hands, trying to muffle the frantic, violent sound of his own breathing. He could hear the creature right at the mouth of the trench, just 10 feet away. It was unhinging its bones. The dry, rhythmic cracking of its joints echoed through the dark as it compressed its torso and shoulders inward, slowly sliding its emaciated body into the narrow opening. Scrape. Slide, scrape. A thick, clear drop of its fluid fell from the ceiling of the trench, landing right onto the back of Austin's exposed neck. It was ice cold, smelling sharply of sulfur and old river clay. With no light and no space to run, Austin reached out into the dark, his fingers desperately searching the mud until they closed around a heavy, sharp limestone shard that had broken off the wall. He gripped the rock, holding it tight against his chest, preparing to fight for his life in the dark. Just as the copper smell became completely overwhelming and a low, wet wheeze vibrated through the air right next to his boots, a sudden bright beam of white light cut through the trench from the far end. A loud, booming voice echoed through the passage. A regional search and rescue team, accompanied by 2 backcountry rangers, had just entered the front chamber of the cave. Austin had left a detailed map of his entry coordinates on the dashboard of his truck at the trailhead, a standard safety protocol he never neglected. When his truck was found abandoned past the park's closing time, the rangers had immediately initiated a sweep of the ravine. The moment the powerful searchlights hit the interior of the trench, the entity recoiled. It let out another wet, gurgling hiss, pulled its long limbs backward out of the gap, and scrambled down into a deep, vertical drainage fissure in the floor of the second chamber, vanishing into the unmapped depths of the aquifer below. The rescue team pulled Austin out of the trench 20 minutes later. He was hyperventilating, his clothes covered in white clay, his hands locked completely rigid around the limestone shard, refusing to let it go until he was safely inside the back of the ambulance. The Missouri Department of Conservation conducted a full structural safety review of the ravine over the following week. When a team of specialized cave rangers descended into the undocumented entry to retrieve Austin's abandoned gear, they discovered that the vertical drainage fissure where the creature had escaped didn't lead to a dead end. The fissure connected straight to a massive subterranean network of flooded conduits that ran for miles beneath the entire Ozark River system. And when the team analyzed the limestone walls around the junction, they found thousands of the long five-fingered claw marks carved deeply into the stone face, worn smooth by years of water flow. Something had been utilizing the dark, flooded passages of the state park to navigate beneath the feet of millions of unsuspecting tourists, campers, and boaters for generations, completely hidden from the upper world. The state authorities permanently closed the rocky ravine 3 weeks later. A heavy construction crew used industrial explosives to collapse the entrance bluff, burying the horizontal fissure under hundreds of tons of solid limestone boulders, erasing the entry from all official park directories. Austin Briggs never entered a cave again. He resigned from his wilderness guide position, sold his home in southern Missouri, and relocated to a modern high-rise apartment complex in downtown Chicago, Illinois, a place where the ground is covered in miles of solid pavement and the artificial lights of the city never turn off. He managed to rebuild a quiet indoor routine, but the psychological scars of that autumn afternoon remain entirely unhealed. He refuses to enter basements, he cannot tolerate dark rooms, and he leaves a high-powered flashlight on his nightstand 24 hours a day. Because according to Austin, the true horror of the experience isn't the memory of the chase or the creature's upside-down face. The true horror lives in the realization of how fragile our safety truly is. Every time he walks across a tiled floor or hears a faint, rhythmic scratching sound from inside a wall vent, his body goes completely cold. He realizes that humanity is just living on a thin, fragile crust of reality, entirely unaware that deep within the deep dark of the world, something impossible is breathing, chattering its teeth, and waiting for the next light to go out. The human body is an incredibly resilient machine, but it has some very hard, non-negotiable limits. If you subject it to extreme cold, you have a very predictable window of time before hypothermia sets in, your core temperature drops, and your vital organs simply decide to turn off. When you choose to go ice fishing in the dead of winter in the northern United States, you understand this risk. You dress in heavy layers, you bring a heated shanty, and you constantly monitor the thickness of the ice beneath your boots. But for 24-year-old landscape photographer Garrett Cole, a solo trip to a frozen lake in northern Minnesota in the winter of 2021 would throw him into a situation where the cold wasn't his only enemy. He would find out that the ice doesn't just keep the water down, sometimes it traps something else entirely. The setting for the story is Lake Vermilion, a massive, deep body of water located in a remote part of St. Louis County, Minnesota. It was the 14th of January, 2021, a day where a brutal Arctic blast had pushed down from Canada, dropping the temperature to a bone-chilling -15 degrees. The wind was howling across the flat expanse of the frozen lake, creating blinding flurries of whiteout snow that completely erased the tree line on the shore. Garrett was an experienced winter outdoorsman. He had driven his four-wheel drive pickup truck out onto the ice earlier that afternoon, parking near a deep trench where he knew the winter pike liked to congregate. He had spent the last 2 hours drilling an 8-inch hole through the 20 inches of solid blue ice, setting up his portable insulated pop-up shelter, and turning on a small propane heater to keep the interior space livable. By 6:30 p.m., the winter darkness had fully arrived. The world outside his nylon shelter was an absolute freezing void, dominated only by the roaring wind. Inside, the amber glow of a battery-powered lantern cast long, flickering shadows against the fabric walls. Garrett sat on a folding bucket seat, staring down into the dark, circular hole in the center of the ice, watching his fishing line dangle into the black water below. The contrast was hypnotic. A small circle of liquid water surrounded by a frozen desert. At exactly 6:52 p.m., the propane heater let out a sharp sputter and died. Garrett cursed softly, his breath instantly forming a thick white cloud in the sudden chill. He reached down to check the gas valve, but before his fingers could touch the metal regulator, he heard a sound. It didn't come from the wind outside, and it didn't come from his truck. It came from directly beneath him, inside the ice itself. It was a heavy, dull thud. Thump. Elijah froze. In the winter, frozen lakes make a lot of noise. As the temperature drops, the ice expands and contracts, creating massive, booming cracks that sound like cannon fire echoing across the water. It is a completely normal, albeit unsettling, phenomenon. Garrett expected to hear the familiar laser-like ricochet sound of a pressure crack traveling across the lake. But this wasn't a crack. 3 seconds later, the sound happened again right at the edge of his ice hole. Thump, thump. It sounded exactly like something heavy and solid striking the underside of the 20-inch ice shelf from the water below. Garrett stood up, pulling his heavy gloves on, and grabbed his powerful tactical flashlight. He approached the edge of the hole, bending over slightly, and shined the bright white beam straight down into the water. The light penetrated the first few feet, illuminating the suspended particles of organic matter floating in the current before fading into the deep, black abyss of the lake. The water was perfectly still. Garrett shook his head, thinking a massive lake sturgeon or an oversized northern pike had simply swum up to investigate his bait and bumped into the ice. He turned away to grab his spare propane tank from the corner of the tent. As his back was turned, a sudden violent spray of freezing water erupted from the hole, splashing against the back of his heavy canvas jacket. Garrett spun around, his heart instantly hammering against his ribs. The water inside the 8-inch hole was sloshing back and forth erratically, overflowing onto the slushy ice floor of the shelter. But there was no fish on his line. The line was completely slack. Then, Garrett noticed a change in the ice surrounding the hole. The blue, solid ice had a slight transparency to it when illuminated by his lantern, and right beneath the surface, about 3 inches down into the frozen shelf, was a dark shape. Garrett dropped to his knees, pressing the lens of his tactical flashlight flat against the ice to cut through the surface glare. The white light illuminated the interior of the frozen block. Moving slowly through the solid ice, just inches beneath Garrett's knees, was a hand. It wasn't a human hand. The fingers were immeasurably long, thin, and skeletal, with gray, leathery flesh that looked completely waterlogged. The nails were pointed and black, scraping against the frozen interior with a faint, muffled ticking sound that resonated through the floor. Tick, tick, tick. Garrett let out a breathless gasp, scrambling backward until his spine hit the vertical support poles of his shelter. His mind refused to accept what his eyes were seeing. The hand was inside the ice. Not in the water beneath it, but actually embedded within the frozen molecular structure, moving through the solid mass as if it were swimming through thick mud. The dark shape moved with a sickening fluid grace, traveling in a circle around the perimeter of the fishing hole. Garrett realized with absolute certainty that whatever this thing was, it was using its claws to score the underside of the ice, systematically weakening the shelf directly beneath his folding chair. Before he could even reach for the zipper of the tent door, the ice beneath his shelter let out a horrific, splintering scream. A massive starburst fracture ripped through the center of the floor. The 8-inch fishing hole instantly collapsed outward, expanding into a jagged 3-foot chasm of black water. The sudden shift in weight caused Garrett's folding bucket seat, his tackle box, and his lantern to slide into the hole, vanishing into the lake with a heavy splash. The shelter tilted violently to the left, the nylon fabric tearing away from the frozen anchors in the wind. Garrett lunged forward, his gloved hands clawing at the slippery edge of the intact ice shelf as his legs dangled into the freezing 40-degree water below. The cold hit his lower body like an electric shock, instantly paralyzing his thigh muscles and stealing the air from his lungs. He struggled to pull himself up, his heavy winter boots filling with water, dragging him down like anchors. As he kicked his legs frantically in the dark water, trying to find a purchase against the submerged wall of the ice shelf, something brushed against his right ankle. It was a firm, freezing grip. A set of long, skeletal fingers closed tightly around his boot, pulling downward with an immense, steady pressure. Garrett screamed into the empty tent, his fingers slipping against the wet, slushy surface of the lake ice as he was dragged an inch lower into the black water. He reached out with his right hand, his fingers scrambling in the dark until they closed around the handle of his metal ice chisel, a heavy, 3-foot steel bar with a razor-sharp edge used to clear ice from the hole. Garrett hoisted the heavy iron bar with his remaining strength and drove the sharp tip straight down into the water near his legs. The metal struck something solid. A muffled, high-pitched screech echoed through the water, vibrating right through the soles of his boots. The freezing grip on his ankle instantly released. Garrett didn't wait. He threw his upper body onto the solid ice shelf, crawling on his belly like a seal, hauling his waterlogged legs out of the chasm just as the entire pop-up shelter collapsed into the hole behind him. He lay on the open ice, fully exposed to the -15-degree wind, his clothes instantly freezing into a stiff, solid armor of ice. He was completely blind in the dark, his lantern gone, the whiteout snow stinging his eyes. About 50 feet away, the headlights of his pickup truck were still cutting through the blizzard, representing his only chance at survival. Garrett attempted to stand, but his legs were completely numb from the thermal shock. He began to drag his body across the frozen expanse, using his elbows to pull himself through the snowdrifts toward the truck. Behind him, from the dark chasm where his tent had been, came the sound of something heavy dragging itself out of the water onto the surface of the lake. It was a wet, rhythmic, slapping sound against the solid ice. Slap, drag, slap, drag. The sound wasn't staying by the hole. It was moving through the blizzard, tracking the line of Garrett's scent in the snow, accelerating with every passing second. The wet, rhythmic, slapping sound against the solid ice was closing the distance fast. Slap, drag, slap, drag. Through the roar of the -15-degree wind, Garrett could hear a low, rattling click, like frozen teeth chattering together at an impossible speed. He didn't look back. Looking back would mean slowing down, and a delay of even a single second meant death. He dragged his frozen, heavy body forward, his elbows scraping raw against the crusted snow, his eyes locked entirely on the twin beams of his truck's headlights, cutting through the whiteout blizzard. He reached the driver's side door, his fingers completely stiff and losing all sensation from the advanced stage of frostbite, fumbled brutally with the frozen door handle. He pulled it with everything he had left, and the heavy metal door swung open, casting a warm, interior yellow glow over the snow. Garrett rolled his body over the threshold into the cab, collapsing onto the floorboards before hauling his leaden legs inside. He slammed the door shut, hit the power locks, and shoved the keys, which were thankfully already in the ignition, forward. The V8 engine roared to life, the heater instantly blowing a faint wisp of lukewarm air into the cabin. Garrett pulled himself up onto the bench seat, his entire body shaking so violently he could barely look straight ahead. He wiped the frost from his eyes and looked out the driver's side window into the blinding sheet of snow. Standing just 5 feet away from the truck, directly in the path of the headlights, was the entity. In the sharp, blue-white glare of the high beams, Garrett could see it with terrifying clarity. It was nearly 7 feet tall, its gray, leathery torso so emaciated that its spine pushed sharply against the skin of its back. It had no clothes, no hair, and its long, multi-jointed limbs were dripping with black, freezing lake water that turned into instant icicles as it hit the air. Its head was elongated, featuring no nose or ears, and its face was dominated by 2 massive, glassy black orbs that completely absorbed the truck's headlights. Its unhinged jaw was wide open, revealing those same jagged, calcified ridges Garrett had felt through the ice, twitching rapidly from side to side to create that horrific clicking sound. The creature didn't attack the vehicle. It slowly raised one of its long skeletal arms, its black pointed claws scraping gently against the driver's side glass pane. Screech. Then, it tilted its head at an impossible angle, its black eyes locking directly onto Garrett through the glass, and it let out a low, wet, gurgling hiss that vibrated right through the metal frame of the truck. Garrett, consumed by pure, unadulterated survival panic, slammed his foot down onto the gas pedal. The four-wheel drive tires spun violently against the thick ice, screaming for traction before the studded rubber finally bit into the snow. The pickup truck lunged forward, swerving erratically across the frozen expanse of Lake Vermilion. Garrett didn't follow the ice road, he just drove blindly toward the faint, distant lights of the shoreline highway, terrifyingly aware that the creature had vanished into the blizzard behind him. He reached the boat launch ramp 20 minutes later, his truck bouncing violently over the frozen shoreline rocks before hitting the safety of the salted asphalt of Route 77. He drove straight to the nearest emergency room in Virginia, Minnesota, where he was immediately admitted for severe hypothermia and advanced stage 2 frostbite on his feet and fingers. The St. Louis County Sheriff's Department launched a full investigation into the incident the following afternoon after Garrett was stabilized. A team of 3 deputies, accompanied by a local wildlife officer, drove out onto the ice to locate Garrett's abandoned equipment and assess the site of the ice collapse. When they located the coordinates of the starburst fracture, they found the portable shelter completely submerged inside the 3-foot chasm of black water, frozen solid into the ice shelf as the temperature had dropped overnight. But what the deputies found on the surface of the ice surrounding the chasm is what turned this file into an absolute psychological horror. There were no human footprints in the snow other than the deep troughs left by Garrett's elbows as he dragged himself to his truck. However, spanning a 300-foot radius around the open water, the ice was covered in hundreds of the long, 5-fingered skeletal claw marks. The marks didn't just lead away from the hole toward the truck. When the wildlife officer used a high-powered ice-penetrating radar to map the structure of the frozen shelf beneath the snow, he discovered that the entire 20-inch layer of ice for 50 yards around Garrett's fishing spot had been systematically hollowed out from below. Something had spent weeks using its claws to carve a massive subterranean network of horizontal tunnels inside the solid ice shelf channels that were just wide enough for an emaciated, leathery body to swim through, hidden completely from the view of anyone standing on the surface. This meant that the entity hadn't just chanced upon Garrett's fishing hole that evening. It had been living inside the ice shelf itself for months, moving silently beneath the feet of dozens of winter fishermen, listening to the vibrations of the augers and waiting for someone to sit alone in the dark after the sun went down. Despite an extensive sweep of the lake by state conservation officers over the next 2 winters, the entity was never seen again. The case remains an open, unsolved mystery in the St. Tep Tess. Louis County Archives categorized officially as an unexplained ice hazard and structural failure. Garrett Cole spent 3 weeks in the hospital, narrowly avoiding the amputation of his toes. He sold his landscape photography business, sold his truck, and left the state of Minnesota entirely within a month of his release. He relocated to a small town in the high, arid desert of New Mexico, where the ground is baked dry by the sun and water is a luxury found only in pipes. He managed to build a new life, but the psychological residue of that Arctic night has never left him. He refuses to travel north during the winter, he won't enter a cold room, and he uses only hot, running water for any daily activity. Because according to Garrett, the true nightmare isn't the memory of the freezing water or the creature's black eyes. The true nightmare lives in the knowledge of what lies beneath the surface of things. Every time he walks across a wooden floor or a tiled room, his body tenses up. His ears listen intently for the faint, muffled sound of something clicking against the supports from below, and he realizes that you can be completely safe, walking through your life with absolute confidence, entirely unaware that just 3 inches beneath your feet, something is waiting for the ice to break.